In this episode of Toolbox, I'll talk about where some of the newest CSS frameworks are taking us, including a demo of all the new CSS features of the most popular, Bootstrap. The pace of the web is relentless, and that's why you need the Toolbox. Hello everyone, this is Ray Villalobos, and I stream about front-end and full-stack tools Wednesdays at 1 p.m. Eastern, 10 a.m. Pacific. You can follow me and subscribe on LinkedIn and YouTube for more content. And if you want to watch any past episodes, make sure you take a look at my blog, raybo.org. Now, over the last several episodes, you've seen me go over a lot of CSS and JavaScript frameworks. It's been pretty interesting to get sort of an overview of where things are. The thing is, all frameworks are like living organisms. They're always changing and adjusting to the environment and new things. Now, last week, Bootstrap did something pretty interesting. They released a minor version as a beta for the first time. So they're on version 5.2 right now. And for the first time ever, they released it as a beta release, which is pretty interesting in itself. I've never seen that before. Usually, the major versions get like an alpha and a series of betas, and then release candidate version, and then it gets released. So for the first time, they've gone to a 5.2 beta. And basically, the huge change in Bootstrap is the addition of a lot of CSS variables. Pretty interesting. Also, they are preparing to apply dark mode into the framework. So that's pretty interesting. It's not there yet, and it's going to take them into the next minor version, which will be 5.3 to apply that. But the changes that they're making right now, they call the biggest change since the release of 5.0. And also, they're all really just getting them ready to make that transition to dark mode, because it's a little bit harder than it seems to just implement that across the whole platform. We've seen just about, a lot of other frameworks really include that in what they do. So let's talk about that. But before that, so we're going to have a demo of all the new CSS features in 5.2, so you can see CSS variables and then some of the other minor things. When you look at the changes, you'll see that it doesn't seem like a really big version, but behind the scenes, there's a lot going on. So another framework that you've seen me use and talk about a lot, Tailwind CSS, has become really one of my favorites. It's not, I would say that Bootstrap is probably still more used than Tailwind, but it's really become my favorite. It's really focused on very small, more frequent updates after version 3.0 that essentially gives it parity with current CSS changes. Now, there's a lot of up-and-comers like OpenProps and Uno CSS that are trying to challenge the way that we're thinking about CSS. And I think the important thing is for you not necessarily to learn all of these frameworks. That's what I'm trying to do with the show, but kind of take a look at trends and where things are taking us, and whether or not some of these new CSS frameworks are something that you might think about using for some of your personal projects. So let me just check the chat really quick to see where people are. So hello, I'm not sure how to say that. Dubuisi, hope I said that correct. And there is Bogdan. So I appreciate you guys coming in. Awesome to see people. Hello, Guido and Samar and Ishmael. And there's Bogdan again, who loves I do love dark mode. I have, as you can tell by whenever I switch over to anything, that I always have dark mode on, right? And I have to remember sometimes to sort of undo dark mode. Sometimes it doesn't quite work for recording, but I do love it. It's so much better. I don't know. I work primarily at night, and usually I don't have any lights on in my office. So, I turn them on for the show, but other than that, I'm running in dark mode pretty much myself. So I got a dog so I could actually get some sunlight, right? Because I wasn't even going out very much. So the dogs really actually helped me. I don't know if you've seen Mojo around, but he's really helped me get a lot more sun. So super good to see everyone. Let's see, John is here. So we've got quite a few people. I'm not sure where everybody's coming from because I only see like 3 people in LinkedIn Live. So I don't know, maybe there's some people coming up from other places. So cool. So this is awesome. There's a couple of more announcements maybe to make before I get started. I'm going to be interviewing some people coming up, so you'll see a lot more interviews with other people as well. I still want to cover a lot of frameworks. It feels like whenever I do, a show on frameworks, I end up sort of discovering a new one, and you'll see that I've done a lot of tutorials for almost all the frameworks that I'll be talking about today, but they keep on coming up with new ones. And so there are some that I want to take a look at. We'll see. I mean, let me know if there's anything that you've seen out there that you want me to cover. I've thought about going maybe more to a model where I cover more sort of a specific kind of features of things, or perhaps like tasks, perhaps like how to do modules. I'm working on switching my blog to Astro, so that's been pretty interesting. It's actually been a lot more fun than I thought. I'm using like Svelte and Astro. I like Astro because it gives you the option of using any framework. So I really need that for what I do, because I switch from like React, but I'm actually preferring Svelte, even though for a while I think Vue.js was my favorite. I'm switching really over to Svelte. I think it's just so straightforward that I really love it. But I really do like what Astro is doing. So yeah, cool. So you'll see more interviews coming on, and hopefully you'll enjoy that. I think it's really cool to honestly to talk to other people about, maybe how they broke in, like what kind of things they're interested in learning about, or what new technologies they're using in their projects and stuff like that. I'd love to hear that. So I know I'll be talking to a lot of people about that sort of thing. So first of all, I wanted to sort of talk about the the reason why we even need frameworks. It seems like there should be something wrong with CSS if we're thinking about using something else. So why do you even need these frameworks? Now, the truth is that you don't even really need them, but you also don't really need cars. They help you get somewhere faster by giving you sort of a streamlined way of generating speed, right? But, they're definitely more comfortable than riding a bike. I mean, I live in Florida, which has like 90% humidity, so I don't even like to be outside in the summer. So I prefer to sort of travel from like air conditioning to air conditioning if at all possible. But frameworks are really just shortcuts to help you do something faster. I think that a lot of people think of something like Bootstrap, which is, one that I've used for quite a long time, as something that helps you do layout. And I think that's really not necessarily what I use Bootstrap for. Bootstrap has a ton of components that just help you build things a lot faster. So for example, we have things like carousels that just make it easier to create sort of a component that you would want to use on your projects. And there's, a ton of different components in the Bootstrap framework. So, there are, let's see, all kinds of stuff here. So in addition to sort of standardizing things and making things a little bit easier, like I love the way the tables work in Bootstrap. It gives you sort of a really nice looking table by default. But then in addition to that, it gives you some additional, like it fixes forms. Forms look so ugly. And that's one of the things I'll be talking about. But some of the defaults in browsers are really horrid. Like they just don't look good. So as somebody who's built pretty large sites, I can tell you that it's really frustrating because if you're building something from scratch yourself, you have to there's so much stuff to first override to make things consistent, and normalization platforms or libraries can help you with that. But then after you've done that, then you have to like do stuff for forms and for tables and for just the regular HTML elements are sort of a pain to work with. So Bootstrap gives you like a nice set of table classes that you can use. It gives you really nice looking checkboxes. They look extra nice now, I think. And then they also give you a lot of components like alerts and buttons and even button groups, which are pretty cool. They kind of look like I guess the old iPhone sort of links. I really love, a lot of people complain, well, do you even need Bootstrap because now you have CSS Grid or you have Flexbox? Why would you even use Bootstrap? Well, I think Bootstrap gives you a nice grid. And one of the changes in 5.0 was, or I think it's 5.1, was the addition of a beginning of a way of incorporating grid, CSS grid into what Bootstrap is already doing. But it isn't really the main reason I use Bootstrap. I use it primarily because I want to get started quick and have something nice that has like all these built-in parts. Like cards are really nice in Bootstrap, and the way that you lay them out is pretty cool. So Bootstrap just helps me get to where I want to go faster by giving me a whole bunch of different components. And so if you're using CSS, not only do you have to create those things, but then you have to, sort of worry about usability and accessibility. And by using something like Bootstrap, you get a lot of great documentation that has a lot of that in the examples. So it's a lot easier to get to where you're going. And they have features like visually hidden here that can help you get things done that you need for accessibility. It has support for prefers reduced motion media and all this stuff. And I feel like, I always think of Bootstrap as being the framework that I would build myself if I had the time. Like when I worked at some of the big places, like I work for Tribune Interactive, and I build, some of the city sites for them. And I feel like if I had to do everything from scratch, I would probably, first of all, make like a bunch of mistakes. But by this being an open source project that is extremely popular and that a lot of people contribute to, I feel that they have worked out a lot of the problems, and they add things constantly, like support for they have like a resizing engine, so that when you make things smaller, it will automatically resize the text, and it has support for right to left, a ton of other things that it would just be too stressful for me to do them myself. And one of the things that I love about Bootstrap is it's becoming more and more customizable over time. So I really like that about the framework and the platform, that it's sort of what I would build myself if I had like a lot of time, and I can feel pretty good like they are keeping it up to date, and it's looking great. So one of the things you may notice is that this is a redesign of their main site. So this looks a little bit different. They changed a couple of things, and you'll see it in the demo. Like I talk over a little bit about the things that they have done. They also have this icon library that is pretty cool. So far they have, I think, 1,600 icons and growing. So it's gone from like, a few hundred to like now 1,600. It's not quite up there to something like Font Awesome, which I think has like, I don't know, like 7,000 plus icons. But I think this is going to keep going and getting better and better over time. So I definitely still love Bootstrap, but it's not really something that I use only for layout. I primarily use it just because it gives me a lot of components out of the box. So what does a framework like Bootstrap do to help you, right? And it's not just Bootstrap, it's other frameworks like Material, and I'll talk about a whole bunch of other ones here in a minute. But one of the things that frameworks try to do is fix some of the problems with HTML. Now, there's a couple of issues with just regular HTML. There's a lot of small variations and bugs in the way that HTML looks between browsers and platforms. And so the way that browsers have usually tried to fix this in the past is by using something called CSS resets, attempting to sort of synchronize the way different browsers and devices work. So with the addition of devices, now we have things that are different sizes. Each one of them have different fonts. And so the way that frameworks have tried to fix this is by using something called Normalize. And this is the way that Bootstrap works. It's pretty typical in frameworks to see something that makes things kind of even across all the platforms. And so the Normalize is just a project that tries to fix some of those problems in between browsers by sort of giving you some good defaults, normalizing the styles, fixing any bugs in between different versions of platforms, and then usability improvements, and so on and so forth. So this is actually the one that Bootstrap uses, and it's pretty common. And sometimes you'll see alternate versions. One of the things that they do, for example, and this has been a change recently, is that they used to try to get everyone to use the same font, and then they realized that, well, if you're on a low-powered device or a device that doesn't have a lot of internet, that device already has a default font. So all of them has switched to using the default fonts instead of trying to sort of have to download a font and load that into your machine. So they don't always make things look exactly the same before, but they kind of fix inconsistencies, and they try to be more sensible by preserving, defaults when they make sense. And then it still tries to fix issues and try to make some of the distances between things similar. However, on the other hand, Tailwind CSS does something that is really almost crazy, using a feature called preflight, or a normalize called preflight. Now, this sounds incredibly crazy because what they're doing is basically normalize, and then they get rid of every default margin. So in Bootstrap, generally, I think margins are added now at the bottom. Well, when you first use something like Tailwind, it wipes out all the margins. So nothing looks like it has any spacing in between elements. Also, everything is exactly like all the fonts are the same size. And it really kind of throws you off at first until you sort of get used to it, because it's quite jarring. So it does, the headings are unstyled. The list items are also unstyled. So when you first load Tailwind CSS, it's sort of crazy because it sort of like wipes everything out, and it makes you add anything that you want. And so anytime you want to add a font size, you have to add it manually. It makes kind of everything a block level, including images. So this is a good change. Like, I actually like this one because images are inline by default. And so, if you have a bunch of text, they kind of float with the text, but they don't break properly. So images are set to block level. It wipes out all the sizes of everything. So an H1 and H2 and H3 look like they're the same size, and you have to add those things manually. Now, what it's trying to do is a little bit different than what Bootstrap is trying to do. It's trying to get you to, sort of start every piece of your layout from scratch. It's really a framework that is fantastic for component-based architectures, like something like React, or any sort of framework that uses components where you are designing each component almost independently. It's not as good. It doesn't have any predefined sort of other components. So it comes with no carousels. It doesn't have accordions. It doesn't have anything. So you have to write those things manually. There are sub frameworks that will add those for you, but Tailwind CSS, at least in its current place, it's really bare bones. So I'm wondering if anybody has used either Tailwind or if you use Bootstrap. I'd love to know in the chat if you're doing that. Let's see, there's a bunch of, yes, I do love CSS, but I do use the frameworks to save me a lot of time when I'm building a lot of things. So there's a couple of other hellos here. Yeah, if anybody has used Tailwind and thinks it's sort of crazy, or maybe you tried it and you didn't like it, I'd love to learn from people that are doing stuff. So there's a couple of frameworks that are doing also something pretty interesting as well. And let me show you one called Mdash. So this one is really interesting because it sets up some defaults, but beyond that, it's trying to make something that is like components. You get all these sort of built-in alerts and all kinds of containers to do things. They look very plain, but what's happening here is that you're getting a library that is sort of like defaults for your browser. So if I take a look at the typography, you'll see that this looks just like regular HTML, right? So the way that you write a headline is just like you would in HTML. Same thing for the paragraph, same thing for the small here. You can see what they look like here. Notice that they are a different font. But if you want to do something more interesting, like an alert, the alert that we just saw, it introduces a set of components that all start with the Mdash, and then a logical sort of name. So to create an alert, you do M-alert, and then you specify a type. and then you put in a message here, and that would create something that looks like this, and you would get all the functionality of this by just using this special tag. Now this is interesting because it's very customizable. So you can make it look nicer. I think it does look a little bit plain, but you're writing HTML that kind of looks just like HTML. It requires, if you just want to use the default, it requires no CSS, and that's sort of an interesting take. Let's make the defaults look better, which I really like. I think the defaults for HTML are ugly and super crazy. So seeing a framework that kind of does a reset, but it goes beyond that, and then it gives you additional components. So you can see that you have the same thing for like an Mdash, and they look like this. And there's a lot of other, here's a bunch of buttons. Now the buttons are interesting. Notice that it's not making you say M button because there's already a tag that makes sense for buttons. So here you just create a button, and then you create sort of a thing called ORD and set it to one of the kind of properties here, and then it gives you these different buttons. So this is pretty interesting. It's kind of newer. I've been meaning to do something with it. Forms, this is kind of interesting too, the way that it lets you use it lets you write forms with just plain HTML, but it's giving you something that looks a lot better. Again, one of my complaints with regular HTML is that if you write a form or do a button and you don't style it at all, they look awful. Now this has given you some sensible defaults, and I really like it. So I'd love to play around with this. It feels a little bit like web components. So we'll see where this goes. And that brings me to another framework that I thought was pretty interesting called Lit. I have seen this one sort of come up more and more in different places. So years ago, we were like interested in doing something called web components. Web components is sort of like what I was talking about with Mdash. It attempts to abstract the functionality of an element and lets you write custom elements. So, when you go to a website and you usually click on like a calendar icon, you get like a drop down that looks like a calendar. Well, the browser is actually giving you that. And that's kind of how web components work. They allow you to create your own tags that have functionality in them, and the tags are generally easy to write. It's very much like what Mdash was doing. It lets you create your own versions of tags, and then you can sort of abstract the functionality into its own component, kind of like what React is doing. But all of the HTML, CSS, and JavaScript live within the component, and when you load it up, you just use it like you would. And this was the problem with Lit. So Lit started out as web components, right? The dream was that when you did web components, you were going to be able to abstract and load up components with all the things that you needed. But at the time, the language for building components hadn't really been around, and so it never really took off. Also, at about the time that it came out, React blew up, creating websites and user interfaces. And so the way that web components were trying to be built was too difficult compared to doing something like in React. And so what happened was people stopped using web components. A lot of people stopped using web components, and they migrated that project into this new framework called Lit. So if you look at the documentation, you'll note that it looks a lot like, let's see if we can see some sample. It looks a lot like something that you would write with React or with Vue.js. So the language is a lot more sort of similar, although it doesn't, this part at least has classes and constructors, which is sort of weird. But it feels more like you're writing something for React. And I think that they realized that the web had changed. People are used to this language that is, component-based, that is sort of hook-based, and where HTML, CSS, and JavaScript are kind of all together living in a component. And so they created this framework. Another interesting approach, it's worth a mention here. I don't know that this is now going to be adopted more than something like React or something like Vue or something like Svelte, but it's definitely something I've been looking to play around with a little more. So let's take a look at some of the questions here. Is this live? Yes, all the lives. You can go to rabo.org, as I mentioned, and if you go to the toolbox, section. As a matter of fact, actually, from the homepage, you'll see that there's an article right here. And if I click on it, you will see that if I played, you would be seeing this show happening right now. So I'm not going to play it because you might hear the sound and it might be annoying. So yeah, and you can find any of the previous episodes just by going here and going to the toolbox and seeing any of the previous episodes of the show. Also, if you want to, you can go to YouTube/Planet of the Web, and you can see the latest sort of episodes here along with, so you'll see that later on today I'll do a demo of Bootstrap, just the new features in 5.2. So what you'll see is that I will post that as I call it a toolbox short. I think it should be like a bit, right? Like a toolbox bit. Anyways, I call it a toolbox short, and you'll be able to see it just the demo by itself without all this other stuff, the Q&A and everything else. So you can look for that as well. And I post some other things in there as well. So you can go to youtube.com/planet of the web and make sure you like and subscribe, right? It's a cool thing all the kids are doing. All right, so let's see if there's anything else here. So I use Bootstrap, but I find that it comes with too much CSS code that I just don't use. Yeah, I agree. See, that's one of the problems of Bootstrap, just some of the other frameworks. The nice thing about using, say, like if you use the base Bootstrap, like the base sort of CSS and JavaScript, and even just the CSS, is that chances are that people have already loaded that from many other sites. So usually what I do is I when I use Bootstrap, I just use it from the CDN. And so you'll see that your sites will load really quick because chances are that they've already been cached somewhere else. It's, big-esque, but it's not really huge. So even though it's loading a lot of CSS, there are ways to improve that by maybe using the Sass version. But really, you're going to end up loading a lot of things. It's just that since everybody's using Bootstrap, it's just about the most popular thing that all that, it's not going to be a huge hit onto your server because it's probably going to be loaded up from cache. But it's a good point. I think it's a fair point. Let's see. I find these frameworks to be double-edged swords. They make all the websites look the same and or original. That's true. However, for some projects, it's exactly what you want. Yeah, a lot of developers and designers love it because they can, the developers can sort of prototype the functionality. They know Bootstrap, but they don't know any design. So it's frustrating for developers sometimes to try to make things look good. They just want it to work, but they want it to look decent enough to work on. So a lot of times you'll see that division between, the designers. And one of the nice things about Bootstrap is that it's really very careful and tries to make it as easy as possible to customize things. So you'll see some of that today. And this is where CSS variables are coming in and affecting the framework. What Tailwind is doing is having this huge effect everywhere else, and you'll see some examples of that. But one of the effects that it did was, I think Bootstrap, at some point, I think in version 4 to 5, they said that the next version of Bootstrap was going to use post CSS, and then Tailwind CSS came out, and it's doing, I think, what Bootstrap 5 would have been if they remained and remained and use post CSS. It's basically Tailwind CSS, but they do have this utility. So both things are kind of getting imported into Bootstrap. The ability to use something like variables, and then also the ability to kind of import, utility type things. So Tailwinds is what they call a utility-based framework. So you'll see that it has, for example, like a whole scale for creating paddings and margins and things like that. And Bootstrap has adopted some of those things, but it's making the framework bigger. So, there's a lot that you can do to customize all these things. But yeah, I think that you'll see that there's other things that you can use. So I'll show you some of those as well. But that's a good point. That's a fair point. Hello from Colombia. Hey, howdy. Practically, I was born in Panama, so Colombia and Panama used to be the same country not too long ago. So I've been using Tailwind. You do need to check out Tailwind. I think, one of the reasons I named this thing the toolbox is because you need to, it's like, when you go fix something in the house or you go fix something in the yard, got a toolbox, you figure out what tool you need for the job. And, if you're doing some plumbing, you're going to use certain tools. If you're doing electricity, which I would never touch, you would use different tools. So I think that it's like you need to know about them. And when you begin a project, you might be called in to use certain things. But, the more tools you kind of understand, how to use or what they're for, the better it is for you. And that's kind of like the whole purpose behind the toolbox. So yeah, thanks for asking questions, and I'll try to break in and answer more as I keep on going on. So yeah, I talked about lit, and yeah, React kind of provided a simpler way. So I'm not sure if lit is going to light up, I guess. So, there's a few things that I think CSS has a harder time with. One of the things that frameworks do is add sort of a layer of convenience on top of CSS. And that's why CSS always feels like it's a little bit behind the frameworks. So if you take a look at something that has been out for 15 years, Sass, the syntactically awesome style sheets, to this day, I mean, it's been around for 15 years, and 15 years on the web is like an eternity. Sass has been successful for that long because a lot of its ideas were just revolutionary. The ability to add variables. They made it a few years ago into CSS, but we've had them for 15 years with Sass. And that's why if you look at the usage of Sass, people really love it. And it can do some things that CSS variables are never going to be able to do because it processes into CSS. This is what Tailwind does. It processes into CSS. And when you have that additional layer, there's just some things that you're going to be able to do that you just can't do with regular CSS. So for example, even to this day, we don't have the ability to adjust colors easily with CSS. I know a lot of these things they appear to be working on, but it's always like they're working on things. And if you add like 4 or 5 different plugins to like post CSS, then you get the same thing as Sass. But Sass has been around for 15 years. It's been battle tested and it works fantastic. I have no problem with anybody using Sass. I still use it. Rabo.org right now is built with Sass, Bootstrap. I am switching it to like Astro and Svelte and Tailwind actually. So, but it works great. I mean, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. Sometimes, there's all these things that you can do with the language. So you have the ability to modify colors like super easily. And then you have things like the parent selector that is being, again, I think this is one of the things that's being built, but the way that it works in Sass is something that is just going to be really hard to implement. Again, because it processes, you have an additional layer where you can, for example, if I did do a course on Sass that is on LinkedIn Learning, the way that you can create multiple elements from, a single like class using the parent selector is really beautiful. And I'm not sure that CSS will ever be able to do that. Also, it's like JavaScript. When you load up a bunch of CSS, it's got to process all that, right? And it's got to, add that to your layout. So something that is pre-processing is going to output the CSS that you're going to need a lot better than something that is having to load into your browser and then having to make some decisions. So I think Sass honestly is always going to be better. I think that, you'll see how Tailwind in a minute, how it does things, I think, a little bit better in some ways. So another thing, this is one of the issues that I have that you might say, well, if you had like post CSS with 3 or 4 plugins, that you'd get something that is really just the same as Sass. But again, you have Sass that's been around for like 15 years. And to me, that's like saying like you add a wheelbarrow to an engine that you would have the same thing as a truck. I mean, it's not the same. It is really good. And that's why people love it. To this day, I think it has like some of the highest satisfaction. So Sass is like, so Sass is like TypeScript for JavaScript, similar, like it just gives you another layer. And when you have another layer, there's just some automation. It's almost like having macros, right? Like you get macros because you can automate a lot of things. Like I got all my lights in this office automated. I just hit a button and it like turns them on and off. That sort of extra layer allows you to do some things that you just can't do with just a regular language. So I think it's always going to be ahead. So yeah, that's a little bit true. So it's a good idea to use Sass. It's a good idea, I think, to learn it and know what some of its advantages are. I do think that I'm not sure that I can say that the world's going to move away from Sass eventually. It's just too good, and it does too many things, I think, well. So I think that is definitely something you should learn if you work on, companies. A lot of companies use it as well. So I'm not sure I'm ready to let it go. I'm good with it. So yeah, check out the Sass course on LinkedIn Learning. I just redid it not long ago, so it's pretty new. So it's really cool. You will like it. In styles components better than Sass. I don't know. I mean, it just depends, I think, on the type of project that you're using. So I would say if you're using a components-based architecture, if you're using React, or if you're using Vue.js, or if you're using Svelte, then something like style components or modules or something like Tailwind CSS is going to be clearly superior. And I'll talk about that in just a minute about why it's better to use some of those things. So I think that this is why, I call this thing the toolbox, because you don't have to know them all, but you kind of should know why they're better for some things. Have you ever tried using like a flat screwdriver on a square like screw or whatever? It works, but it's just not like the best. So sometimes it's just good to know that, hey, maybe if I tried this other thing, it would be better. So yeah, let's see. So yeah, CSS has its own version of, one of the things that came out a long time ago for CSS was variable. I mean, for Sass was variables, and they're, again, I think they're just superior to what you could do with just normal CSS. And now CSS has its own version of variables called custom properties. So it's similar, but I think that this is also highlights one of the other issues, I think, with just normal CSS, that you're using because you're trying to make things backwards compatible. You have to use a less, understandable sort of language. So when you create a variable, you use these two dashes, and you create your variable. You either do it in an element if you want it to be associated with a specific element, or if you want to define a root variable, you can do it like this, and then you have to use the var function keyword when you want to use it. I mean, this just isn't as good as something like Sass that lets you do variables kind of how you would understand them, and then you can do things like mix-ins. Honestly, sometimes just having that layer makes it a little bit better. So yeah, to use these, normally you would use that root section in CSS, and then you would apply the variables. So it's great. And I think you'll see in a minute that a lot of frameworks actually use variables, and I think they're a fantastic thing. But I think there's probably a little bit more that you can do with Sass. So what are some frameworks doing with this? One of my favorite, actually, before I get into some of these other frameworks, I did want to show you one that you've probably seen me use a lot. If you've seen actually, this is something else. So this is a framework called Pollen that is designed to use pre-existing variables. So basically, if you were creating something like Bootstrap or a design language from scratch, what you would want to do is create a bunch of variables that set things up, like your typography or perhaps some variables for your layout. And so this is kind of like somebody's idea of what a relatively interesting defaults or a decent set of defaults would be. So this is nice because it gives you kind of a starting point. It sets up like, okay, what scales would you need to use this? And it creates them for you. They're inspired by Tailwind CSS, so the sizes are very similar, and it gives you like a decent grid. Not a lot of stuff. This is a very small framework, but this is something that people have done. So this one is called Pollen, and it seeks to look at a set of variables that I think are a good starter template, and you can start with them and customize them as well. So I like this framework because it just gives you a good starting point. Now, another one that is a little bit more complicated, but I think a lot more powerful, is this thing called OpenProps. So this framework basically is another set of preset variables, but they're organized a little bit better. You can load just the pieces that you need. and they have a few more features in here. So you can, for example, load just the headings, the paragraphs, like all these things. Or actually, you can load different pieces of the framework. If you don't need form elements, you can leave them out. It's a little bit odd, but the other thing is that they're very easy to customize. So you can see that you have them broken up into these different sort of segments. And then you can load, for example, animation prop packs if you want to do some animation things. And you'll see that it has a bunch of other features. So let's see. The scales are pretty similar to something like Tailwind's, and it has a really large color sort of structure that you can use, and it has some built-in gradients, so some filters and some animation properties, as well as some other things. So again, if you're doing your own thing, sometimes these can help you get 80% of where you need to go, and then this particular one is built around customizability. So it's a good way to start things, because they'll help you with a lot of the code that you would have to write yourself, and it's already been kind of pre-thought out for you. All right, so one of the big problems designers have when they're trying to solve problems with CSS is the cascade. So this is the C in CSS, right? And it lets the browsers basically decide when there's two styles that are saying the same thing, which one do I apply, right? Usually styles that are kind of above other styles will get applied first. Now the new thing with CSS is the addition of layers, so you can control the order that things are applied in. Now with a lot of frameworks like Bootstrap, when I use Bootstrap, you end up writing a lot of code that overrides the defaults, or the way that something looks, right? So one of the things that Tailwind CSS developed was this utility first approach, and this is what makes it so different. That with Tailwind CSS, the way that we used to write, or the way that you even to this day write things with Bootstrap, is something like this. You define a component, and then inside that component, you define like maybe a wrapper, and then you put in an item in there, and then maybe you create some other wrapper for some other content, et cetera, right? And then you have to write all those styles. And what ends up happening is, if you want one of these elements to look a little bit different, then you have to start overwriting the defaults, right? So if you don't like this color, then you have to write either different versions of the style. So you would have to write a chat notification green or something, or primary or secondary. So a lot of when you use a framework, or even when you're using your own CSS, a lot of times you're spending a lot of time overwriting things. And as style sheets get bigger and bigger, it's harder and harder to figure out why certain things are happening, because the rules that are being overwritten cascade and become harder to find. And that's what something like Bootstrap does well too. They have thought about things really well, and they make things, by writing CSS a certain way, they make it easier to sort of structure your code. So the thing that Tailwind and a lot of newer frameworks are doing is getting rid of all that and letting you basically get as close to the style tag as possible. So here's the same sort of component written with Tailwind. You're basically saying, I want a padding of 6 units. I want the maximum width of this to be a small, width, MX auto, which means margin in the X direction auto. Add a background that's white. Give it some rounded edges at the XL size. So you can see here that it's very utility based. It doesn't care what the item is. It just cares about how it should look. And again, this works very well when you have, something like a React component, right? Where you want the CSS to kind of live with the HTML and the JavaScript. And you can go in there and style it pretty easily, because it's self-contained and it's probably going to be used over and over in different places. So this works fantastic for anything like React. So that actually also solves the problem of overwriting anything, because the styles are right there where you need them. There's no overwriting anything before it. It doesn't matter where this component is. It's always going to have the same shadow, the same spacing, the same padding, the same width. So that, I think, is pretty cool. A little bit weird, but still, I think a really good approach. And that's really been the revolutionary thing about Tailwind CSS. Now, another addition was that you can add custom styles now to Tailwind CSS, and this has been kind of a newer addition. So with Tailwind, you have a lot of sort of scales for how things are applied. So if you, for example, let's see, if you do like, let's do like gap here. So if you look at the gap, there is a bunch of different sizes for gaps, right? And it has a scale. So what you'll notice in Tailwind is the way that, say, like fonts, well, not necessarily fonts, but like the width of things, borders, gaps, things like that have a similar set of numbers to make it kind of consistent. But occasionally you want to, break up the grid or break up your scale a little bit. So one of the additions have been recently the ability to just add custom styles. So you can easily create just the styles you need for an element. So you can just use brackets instead of using the default scales for anything, and it will take them. And the beautiful thing about Tailwind CSS is that it will only output the code that you need. So if there is only one place where you're adding this this class called top, then only that CSS will be written. So this beats something like Bootstrap that has to always load everything. The way that Tailwind works is it looks at your HTML and your JavaScript files and it says, oh, I'm using the following styles here, so I'm only going to output the ones that I need. So you will get super tiny, super tiny sort of CSS output with something like Tailwind. And it does it also while you're coding. It does this in real time. So as you're writing the code, it actually outputs like CSS, and it's only a very tiny amount of CSS that you need. That's one of the things that makes it just super dominant in the industry now, especially on things like React or Svelte or those kind of component-based architectures. It's also very easy to customize. If you don't like the colors that it comes with, you can customize it. And again, you don't even have to customize it because you can use any color you want. However, if you're using the colors throughout multiple components, you would want like the blues to be the same on all the components. You wouldn't want to use, custom styles for everything in that case. So I think that, and the nice thing about Tailwind is that that's not even my favorite part of the framework. My favorite part is that the way that it handles states. And this is something that I think it's difficult to do with CSS and with any other framework, that it lets you handle any kind of pseudo classes by adding this additional language. So what this is saying here is I want you to normally make the background of this element sort of this blue right here that you see, but when you hover over it, I want you to modify it to be a darker color, and that's what's happening right now. So you have these modifiers that allow you to control what happens in different states, and it can handle any pseudo class selectors. So you can do something if this is the first item, the last item, an odd item, an even item. There's form states, so you can easily do things like, what do you call this? You can easily test for certain, items in input fields. You can do before and after, placeholder. I mean, this thing is really well done. And the additions, this is what I was talking about earlier about what Tailwind is keeping up with, is anytime a new thing gets added to CSS, Tailwind will have a version of it. So it's really good about keeping up with the latest and greatest. And you can see that it has these kind of things for media queries. So you can easily say whenever we're at the medium breakpoint, this is how many columns this grid should have, et cetera, et cetera. There's also states like open close states, and you can also create your own custom classes. This is people think that the utility based stuff is the best part. This is actually my favorite part of Tailwind, because imagine what you would have to do to control when an element does something in a bunch of different instances. Like you'd have to write media queries, you'd have to write state classes. It would get very messy to write all that CSS, and then you'd always have to worry about it polluting something else in your layouts. So this is my favorite part of the language. So let's see. Now there's a few contenders to Tailwind CSS. and I'll show you a few of them. So there's this one called MasterUI. Same sort of concept. I think it has a few more animation features. You can see that it's kind of animation-y, I guess I would call it, but it has the same kind of concepts where you are controlling different things about the platform depending on state. And similar language, but not exactly the same. So you can see that it has font colon and then the size of the font. I think they try to be more concise in the way that they name things. It's not as popular as Tailwind CSS. And the language is slightly different, but I think they're doing some good work here by making things a little bit more concise. And it does have a lot more or more maybe sort of animation and filtering kind of features that help you control things. And I do believe that they do try to make things a little bit more concise. Yeah, see, like class names is too long. So they are trying to make things more concise by giving you combo animation features like this and acronyms and stuff like that. So I don't know, like if you're good with Tailwinds, I think Tailwinds is the dominant one, but I like to see these sort of experiments that are trying to push even what Tailwind is doing. And then there is another one that I have mentioned before in the toolbox called Uno that I'm keeping an eye on, because before Tailwind CSS didn't have the just-in-time compiler. So that's the feature that writes CSS based only on the elements that you're using, makes Tailwind super fast and also super small. So in I think version, I want to say 5.1, that they released that just-in-time feature, and it's no, it must have been 2 point something, because now I think they're on 3.0. Anyways, this Uno CSS comes from a framework that actually introduced that just-in-time feature. But now that Tailwind has caught up with that feature, they started to go in their own direction, similar to what that other framework MasterUI was doing. But the only problem with this one is that the documentation isn't quite there. So I'm keeping track of this one. I think it's one to sort of take a look at. It's going to work really well with Nuxt.js, so that's sort of interesting. Now, if you want to look at the sort of, I'm not sure what to say about this one. It's not the bleeding edge, but something that is doing something similar but different is this one called Assembler CSS. And this one tries to give you a way of creating CSS and that is kind of based on the style tag. So if you think about what Tailwind CSS is doing, it's trying to give you the ability to create utilities that are very similar to essentially using just the style attribute in CSS, right? So this one actually says, well, if you're trying to use a style attribute, why not use that entire language, right? So the way that this one works is by letting you, let's see, it kind of embraces the style tag. So this is how you would write, for example, this style for this box, you would write it like this, right? You would say the background color is this, the width is this. So this allows you to create the same thing, but instead of using the style attribute, you use the X style attribute. And then you can use the same language, right? So this is essentially this right here, copied to this new X style, but you can also then use shortcuts, and the shortcuts again are similar to Tailwind. So you would know these things if you use Tailwind. So you can make things a little bit faster, and then you can also create variables, and you still have the ability to create things based on state, which is pretty cool. Now, yeah, the language is kind of a combination of the style tag, but with Tailwind inspired states, classes, and custom elements. So that's where we are with CSS frameworks. If anybody has any questions, I think that's great. But let's go ahead and take a look at we don't have a ton of time. I think we're cutting getting short here. So let's take a look at Bootstrap 5.2 beta 1. And you'll notice that first thing you'll notice about it, as I mentioned, is that there is a new design. The whole site has been redesigned from scratch. A couple of minor things that you may not notice is that the colors are a little bit different. Basically, this purple right here is a little bit brighter. I'm not sure I'm crazy about the super bright purple. And it's weird because the purple isn't like a color in their color names. Like there's no, it's like primary, secondary. Primary is like a blue. The purple does exist, but it's kind of hidden from view, I guess. The edges are a bit rounder in this version. So if you look at things like buttons, they'll be like a little bit rounder. And I welcome that because I always thought the roundness of things was really kind of square. So they've added that. And the big change to this is the addition of configuration variables. Again, this is inspired from Tailwind CSS. So let's play the demo and we'll take a look at all the new features and not including the Sass features, but just the CSS features of Bootstrap 5.2. Let's take a look at how you can use variables in this version of Bootstrap. So here's how you would normally use a variable. You would target an element, and then in that element, you would set up a, say, color, and here you can use a variable. Now, Bootstrap provides a number of existing variables, and you can see them all right here on this page. There's a ton of them. So for example, if we wanted to use the blue variable, we could just use BS blue right here and it would use this color. Let's try that. So 2 dashes, BS, and then we'll use the blue color here. You can see that it worked just fine. But if you want to, you can override any of these existing variables in the root and of course, then use them. So we could say, and this is just how we use variables in the root section, we're going to redefine the way a specific variable works. So we will redefine the way BS primary works. And now notice that since I've used that variable in this headline, it's changing the color of the primary variable in the headline. It's not affecting this button. So you do have to manually override each individual element. So if I wanted to, say, modify the way that buttons work, I would have to redefine the way that BTN primary works here. And so now the addition is that there are specific variables attached to most of the elements that you can use with any of the components. So now there's a variable called BS, BTN, BG, and in here you can use BS primary. Now, if you want to, you can redefine other things. Notice that the buttons have this outline around them, and they also have a hover state. And so there's a whole bunch of additional variables that you can modify here. So you could say, let's do the BS, BTN, border, color, and we'll redefine that to be a new variable that we'll create called dark purple. So now I have to create that variable here in the root, and we'll give it a darker color. If you want to know which variables are available for each component, you can just do a search in the documentation. And generally at the bottom of the page, you'll see a section for the variables. And here's the ones that are available for the buttons. Now, these right here are the Sass variables. They're not the just plain CSS variables. Those are a little bit further down here. Now, what you see here is also a combination of the regular CSS variables, which you can override pretty easily. But then there's also some Sass variables that allow you to make things darker. You won't be able to use this in regular CSS, but you can at least use the name of the variables that are right here. Let's take a look at some of the other features. In Bootstrap, you can easily change the background color of an element by adding a BG and then one of the colors. So you can say BG danger like this, and it'll change the color of the background. But sometimes the text doesn't look good because it doesn't have enough contrast against that background. What you used to do is add a text color class, and then you would say something like text white here to change the color of the text to something that looked a little better. But now there's a better way of doing this, and that is by using the text BG. So you can say something like danger here, and it does the same thing, but it automatically will apply a good contrasting color. And you can use that all over the place. By default, this will give you these color combinations. If you use a light color, it makes the text black. If you use the dark color, it makes it white, and so on and so forth. You can still override them by using the traditional classes as well. So if you did want that text to be yellow, you could still use text and then warning here, and it would change the text to yellow as well. But it's just a little bit quicker to use the defaults now. That's a pretty good change. Let's talk about a couple of other minor changes. I'm going to change this right here to warning first, just to make it a little better. First is the addition of a new font weight. You now have the option of using the semi-bold option here. So this is of course different than the bold or the medium. You also may notice a slight change in the roundness of some elements, and there are a couple of classes that you can use now as well to determine the roundness of something. So you now have rounded 4 and rounded 5 as additional options. So let's see those. We'll do a round edge right here. So roundness 4 gives you just sort of a wider roundness right here. And as I mentioned, the default roundness is already a little bit different. And you also have roundness 5 for some pretty massive roundness. Next up is a small change to the off-canvas component. So if you haven't used this before, what it allows you to do is to create a menu that comes from one side. With this new version, what you can do is control when that button appears so that it's responsive. Right now, by default, this button and the sidebar will appear no matter what size you're in. So this new change, which is pretty minor, allows you to just say something like off-canvas LG, and now the sidebar will appear only in items that are below the large size. So you'll see that at some point, you'll actually get to see part of the sidebar, which is a little bit weird. And that means that you have to control it by also hiding it manually. So you would say something like DLG none here, and that would hide the component. Now that means that this button doesn't really make any sense whenever you're in the large size. So once I'm here, if I click on it, notice that it makes the background darker, but it doesn't appear, which means that I should also hide this button, DLG none. Now that hides the button and also the sidebar. I don't know that this is that particularly useful, but it's another option that you have when working with Bootstrap 5.2. Here's a couple of minor changes to tables. You have the ability to define when a table stripes vertically. So generally, when you add the table striped class, the table stripes horizontally. So every other item would be striped. But now you can do that vertically with striped columns. To do that, all you have to do is add a table striped columns class here. And now you can see the color changes on every other column. Now, one thing that you may notice is that before, there used to be thick lines in between the table head or the T head and the T body. That has now been reset so that the lines are always the same. You can put in a thicker divider manually now. So if we go to, let's say, the table hover section here, I'm going to go into the T body and add a class here of table group divider. So now I need to scroll down and you can see the thicker divider right here. There are no color classes or any other utilities yet. There are some utilities in Sass, but for now, this is all you can do with this new class. Let's talk about a couple of changes to Scroll Spy. It's a little bit easier to write because you do not need a position relative container. What Scroll Spy does is it takes a look at what's showing up on the page. And as you scroll, you'll see that different parts of this navigation will highlight. It does that by letting you specify this data spy scroll here, and then also a target that is going to control the scroll. Now, normally this goes in the body section, but you can put it in other subsections as well. And there's a couple of examples on the website in the documentation. So you can see here that you can get it to highlight things as they appear. Now, it's using a new technology called Intersection Observer. This is a JavaScript API, and I think it works a little bit differently. So now when I scroll to Dolores, you'll see that it highlights. And when Bubbles appears on screen, it'll also highlight. But when Dolores leaves the screen, it'll unhighlight, which is interesting. I'm not sure I like this a lot better, but you can see Bubbles there started to highlight as soon as it, actually a little bit before it came on screen. So right about there, it noticed, I guess, that it was about to be on screen and then it highlight. There's a couple of other minor changes to this as well. So there's a couple of methods that will let you control how this works, and they have changed. There's one called root margin now that allows you to control the offset. Now, I tried using this in this beta version of Bootstrap and it wasn't working well for me. It also allows you to control the smooth scrolling when a user clicks on a link. This is also interesting that all the components now support an experimental data attribute called databsconfig that allows you to sort of save a JSON version of the config variables. And look how it's strangely coded. Any attribute would normally have a regular quote. Now this one has a single quote, and then you have double quotes inside because this is a JSON formatted element. So you can use allegedly this notation. Again, I tried it and I couldn't get it to work. There is some interesting changes that you have to do. So like, even though it is camel case right here, when you do specify it in the examples, you'll see that it is written as bs-root-margin. And that's interesting. I think it's kind of nice that it is a little bit simpler, but the engine underneath has been modified so that it's using the JavaScript API for intersection observer. All right, so let's take a look at one more thing, and that is a class addition to form checkboxes, switches, and also radio buttons. So basically what happens now is that in addition to form check, we have form check reverse. And what that does is align things to the right. Sometimes you wanted things to be aligned to the right, so this is sort of nice. And you can do it over here as well. It also works with radio buttons. So you can see they align also. Now an inline element, it's going to align each individual item to the right, not the entire thing. And then also the same thing happens with switches. So you could just add that to a switch. And you can see that now even the switches are right aligned. So though that's a very tiny change, it seems like it's something we should have had a long time ago. So I'm pretty happy about this one, even though it's a tiny minor change. So cool. Hopefully you enjoyed that demo of Bootstrap 5.2. I really love Bootstrap. It's one of my favorite frameworks. I use it to this day, and for certain projects, it's my go-to framework. I mean, I am using Tailwind for sort of component-based architectures more. I think that's the right framework, but it's all about, always using the right tool for the job. The jobs become easier when you kind of know why things are different and when you should look for, a different tool for the job that you're doing. So thank you so much for watching. And I don't see any additional questions. So there's obviously some different people that came in. Yes, I love round buttons, and I like them to be rounder. Like, I don't want like a little tiny bit of roundness. And that was my problem with Bootstrap. I'm really happy about the sort of fuller buttons now. So yeah, good to see everyone that came in. I appreciate it. Like I said, I'll be doing some interviews coming up. I'm going to be recording them pretty soon, and then I'll be posting them in addition to other things. Just let me know what you want me to cover. I'd love to hear it. Just reach out to me on LinkedIn. It's probably the best place to get me. I'm linkedin.com/in/planet of the web. I'm pretty much planet of the web anywhere, on Twitter and on YouTube. And, I am on TikTok, but I don't go on TikTok. So don't try to look for me there. Although I am there. That'd be funny if you actually, I don't know, my page doesn't have anything in it. So I think I used TikTok for like 30 seconds. And I was like, what is this crazy thing? Until I got out of it. So anyways, good talking to everybody. Well, so there's a couple of questions here. Which is better for React projects, Bootstrap or Tailwind? I think hands down Tailwind is better for React type projects. It's made for that type of thing. I've used Bootstrap before for React projects, but I think definitely something like Tailwind or some of these other frameworks do a better job with component-based architectures. So definitely something worth a look if you're working in that environment. So yeah, Twitter, definitely just at Planet of the Web is my Twitter. And this actually rebroadcasts in Twitter. So you could have watched this in Twitter as well. Follow me there. Yeah, I guess whatever that's my attitude as well. Just whatever gets the job done and makes sense to you. I mean, I think you should know as a professional. I'm trying to help you, or trying to help people like know what's out there, know what the options are. And sometimes I think that, if you're in a component-based architecture, I would highly recommend Tailwind CSS. If you're just building a quick website, Bootstrap for the win. I still love it. Rabo.org is built with Bootstrap. Like I said, I'm rebuilding it, but it's for me, it's more about using the right tool. You'll find that it's just easier and better, and you'll enjoy life more. I know that sometimes with Bootstrap SaaS, it's been kind of a struggle to keep everything up to date, and with things changing, it feels like something like Tailwinds has been a little bit easier, especially now that I'm rewriting the site in Tailwinds and Astro and Svelte. So that combination seems to be pretty cool. So yeah, good talking to everybody. What an exciting day. So hopefully I'll talk to you again soon. Y'all take care.